He didn't even get to taste the honey. One moment, he was reaching for a glass jar on a market counter, and the next, the bees came. A Saturday morning in late summer, warm concrete, the smell of lavender and fresh bread, and then a swarm descending on spilled sweetness like a dark cloud with a purpose. The first sting landed on his neck, the second on his wrist, the third on his lower lip. He had known about his allergies since childhood, and the EpiPen was in his car, 2 blocks away. His throat began to close. His legs folded. He fell sideways into the spreading pool of amber honey, while strangers dialed emergency numbers and waved at bees they couldn't scatter. His heart pounded once, twice, then stopped. The last thought that crossed his mind was almost embarrassingly small, a quiet regret that he hadn't bought that jar before knocking it off the shelf. Then nothing. No tunnel, no light, no choir. Just an absolute and total darkness that pressed in from every direction at once. And then pain, a completely different kind of pain, dull and deep and spreading through every muscle, like something had wrung each fiber dry and stuffed it back over the bones. Cold came next, a wet and piercing cold that had no mercy in it. He opened his eyes. The sky above him was gray. Not city gray, not smog gray, but a living gray. Heavy clouds rolling so low they seemed close enough to touch. Beneath him was something hard and wet. Boards, moving boards, rising and sinking in a slow, rhythmic pulse. Waves. He turned his head and saw the carved beast snarling from the prow, its wooden mouth stretched open against the wind. Rows of oars stretched out on both sides, moving in unison with mechanical precision. He tried to lift his arm and found he couldn't. His wrists were bound with rough rope, and something cold and heavy pressed against his throat. Iron. An iron collar, rusty and ancient, fitted to his neck like he had always belonged to it. He looked at the hands in his lap and did not recognize them. Thin, dirt-blackened, cracked at every knuckle, with nails broken down to nothing. The body was young, maybe 20 years old, but it had been hollowed out by hunger and labor until the ribs showed through the torn fabric of the shirt. Around him sat others in the same condition, same ropes, same collars, same empty eyes, staring at nothing. The word arrived in his mind, without invitation, clean and certain. Thralls. Slaves. The absolute bottom of Scandinavian society, ranked below livestock, below working dogs, below the worth of a broken tool. A boot connected with his thigh, and he looked up into the face of a huge bearded man with 2 red braids and an axe on his belt. The man said something in a language that sounded like stones rolling downhill, and the body responded before the brain caught up. His hands found the oar on their own, muscle memory from the body's original occupant, and he began to row. Pain shot through his back and shoulders with every stroke, but he kept pulling. Because the red-bearded man was watching with the particular boredom of someone looking at an object, not a person. He rowed and tried to think. He had died at a farmer's market in the 21st century and woken up on a Viking longship in the cold waters of the early medieval North Sea. Either this was the dying hallucination of an oxygen-starved brain, or something far stranger had happened. But the smell argued against hallucination. Sweat and fish and sea salt and wood tar and worse things, a combination no dying brain would invent. He was 34 years old with a college education and a head full of history books. And right now, none of that was worth a single extra mouthful of water. He rowed. The hours passed in gray monotony, the sky unchanging, the waves lifting and dropping the ship like something the sea was considering and rejecting again and again. By what he estimated was evening, someone tossed a single piece of stale bread to the 6 thralls. He received a piece the size of 2 fingers, hard as river rock, and he chewed it so slowly and deliberately that he could feel each crumb.
The body had been trained to survive on crumbs.
At night, they were not untied. He lay shivering on the planks while spray came over the side and hit his face, his teeth chattering loudly enough that it seemed the whole ship should hear. No one heard. No one cared. He stared up at the sky, and when the clouds parted for a moment, he found the North Star, then Cassiopeia, then calculated the bearing. Southwest, toward England or Francia. A raid. He knew what a raid meant from the textbooks, from the museum displays, from the documentary footage viewed through headphones while standing in climate-controlled galleries. He knew that in a few days, this ship would beach on a foreign shore, and the men around him would go ashore with axes.
And the thralls would haul the loot, and any thrall too slow would be left on the beach with something sharp through his ribs.
He closed his eyes against the spray and made his first plan in this new life.
3 points.
Survive until shore. Become useful. Do not die.
Simple as a stone, and just as heavy.
He did not sleep. Instead, he watched and counted and memorized. 30 warriors, maybe 35, blended into a mass of fur and iron. 6 thralls, including himself, 2 of them barely more than boys, one of whom coughed through the night with a sound like wet wood being split. He listened to that cough and thought about what he knew of respiratory illness in this era, and what he knew was not comforting. The biggest thrall, maybe 40 years old, moved slowly and carried a map of white scars across his back from years under someone else's whip. There was a woman who never lifted her eyes, not once, and an old man who rode on pure automation, eyes fixed on nothing, long past the point of being present in his own body. He studied them all and filed each detail away.
In the morning, the red-bearded overseer walked the row of thralls and kicked each one like checking wagon wheels for air.
When he reached the coughing boy, he stopped and weighed something with his eyes. The look was the look of a man deciding whether to discard a tool now or wait until it broke completely. He decided to wait. The boy could still row. A wineskin came around, 2 sips each. The water tasted of leather and something sour, and the body wanted more, and he forbade the body. 2 sips was the rule. Discipline was the only currency he had. He turned to the work of learning language. Without words, he was deaf and mute, and a deaf-mute slave was a dead slave. He listened to the Vikings as they moved around the ship, and he matched every word he caught to an action, an object, a direction. Ore, water, food, go, stop, faster, ship, shore, wind, rope, knife, and a word they used every time they addressed the thralls, a word that meant something like nobody. 12 words on the first day. He repeated them silently, building the connections, turning each one into a small anchor he could reach for when he needed it. He also watched the helmsman, lean, weather-beaten, with calm eyes that read the water the way others read faces. He stood at the stern tiller and moved it in small increments, and the whole massive ship followed his hands like a living thing obeying a thought. He was a navigator, the best man on the ship after the jarl, and the man sitting in chains on the rowing bench 3 meters away knew something the helmsman did not. He had the entire North Atlantic mapped in his skull, every current, every shoal, every dangerous headland, the Gulf Stream, the bearing to Iceland, the geography of the English coast.
He said none of this.
A slave who knows more than his master is not a useful slave. He is a dangerous slave, and dangerous slaves do not last long on open water. He rowed and kept quiet and listened and memorized. By evening, the coughing boy's oar had fallen out of rhythm. The red-bearded man struck him across the back of the head with an open palm. The boy coughed harder, and then pink foam appeared at the corner of his mouth. Not pneumonia. The realization arrived cold and certain. Tuberculosis, the active form, and they were all breathing the same air in the same confined space. He could not move away. The rope gave him half a meter of freedom and no more. So he did the only thing available. He turned his face into the wind so that the boy's exhaled air would travel in the other direction. A small adjustment, invisible, something no one noticed. But it was the first conscious decision he had made in this new life, the first application of knowledge that had nothing to do with brute force. Simple epidemiology. Turn your face into the wind. That night, he watched the stars shift and confirmed what he already suspected. The ship had turned south. At roughly 6 knots, maybe 7, they were perhaps a day's sailing from the English coast. He lay in the dark and thought about what chaos at a raid might offer, and what a single wrong move would cost, and he decided to be patient. On the 3rd morning, seagulls appeared. 3 of them circling and diving, which in this world meant land was close. The mood on the ship changed immediately. Weapons came out for sharpening. Leather helmets were pulled on. Men pushed and laughed with the particular energy of people preparing for work they enjoy. He got his first good look at the jarl. Tall by half a head above everyone else, broad shoulders, light hair pulled back, chainmail that caught the pale light and confirmed serious wealth. A sword at his belt, where the others carried axes. He stood at the carved prow and said nothing, watching the horizon with the patience of a man who had done this many times and expected to do it many more. Beside him stood a shorter man with quick eyes and a bundle of carved runes hanging from his neck. No weapons, just those runes and that watchful expression. A priest, or whatever this world called the person who spoke to gods and advised leaders. He filed the priest away as someone who could be useful or dangerous, or very likely both at once. The coast appeared by noon, a thin green line above the gray water, thickening into hills and a gray beach, and small houses with thatched roofs and smoke rising from chimneys. The Vikings released a sound that was not quite a shout, more like a roar, 30 voices combining into something that made the air itself seem to vibrate. He felt a hair rise on his arms, not from excitement, from understanding. The ship hit the sand with a shudder that rattled every plank, and the warriors went over the side into the shallows, foam and shouting and axes raised, running toward the village. He sat tied to his bench and watched. The door of the nearest house burst open under a kick. A woman's scream, high and short, then silence. He had stood in front of museum displays and listened to reenactments of this sound through headphones. This was not that. This was the real thing, and the real thing was much worse, because you cannot reach for a pause button when the sound is happening around you in actual air. When the red-bearded man came back and untied the thralls from their benches, he lengthened their ropes rather than removing them. 10 paces of freedom, enough to reach the shore and carry things. The gesture was clear without a word of translation. Haul the loot. He jumped into the freezing water, felt his legs go numb to the knee, waded to shore, and lifted the first sack. Barley or rye, maybe 60 pounds, and his legs nearly buckled under it. He carried it to the ship and went back. 4 trips. On the 5th, he fell, knees simply giving out under him, the sack collapsing beside him on the wet sand. The red-bearded man looked at him, looked at the sack, said something contemptuous, and walked away without striking him. He got up. He picked up the sack. He carried it, because a thrall who doesn't carry is useless, and useless thralls become something else very quickly. On his 7th trip, he noticed something among the piled loot. Bundles of herbs, dried and fresh, taken from the village, along with everything else, simply because the Vikings took everything. He recognized yarrow, plantain, something with the soft white flowers of chamomile. In his previous life, these were his grandmother's cold remedies. In this life, they were the only medicine that existed. He memorized their position, then went back to hauling sacks. On his next pass, he reached down without breaking stride and tucked a handful of yarrow under his shirt. A quick movement. Unremarkable, unnoticed. Yarrow, a hemostatic, an antiseptic, something to slow bleeding and reduce the risk of wound infection.
He pressed his hand against his ribs to hold it in place and kept walking.
It was the first thing he had obtained in this world on his own terms. Not handed to him, not tossed at him like bread to a dog. Taken. By nightfall, the raid was done, and the ship pulled away from shore with new cargo, including 2 new captives, a man and a woman with wide, terrified eyes, who did not yet understand what the next year of their lives would mean.
He looked at them and saw himself from 3 days ago.
The orange glow of burning thatch spread across the black water as the ship moved away. Beautiful if you didn't think too carefully about what was burning and who had been inside.
He lay on the planks that night and thought about what he was. 0, at the very bottom of a world that had no floor beneath this point. Meat on bones tied to an oar.
But a 0 has one useful quality.
No one expects anything from a 0. No one watches a 0. No one fears what a 0 might be concealing. And so a 0 can do things others don't notice. Pick herbs, count stars, memorize words, accumulate. Bit by bit, until there is enough. On the 4th morning at sea, he woke to silence. The coughing boy's sound had been a constant presence through 3 nights, and its absence was the thing that pulled him out of sleep. He turned his head. The boy was curled on his side, mouth open, skin already carrying the particular gray shade that belongs only to the dead. The red-bearded man came, looked, spoke a single short word, untied the rope, removed the iron collar, because iron could be used again, and dragged the body to the side. He lifted it and tipped it over. Splash. The oars didn't miss a beat. He watched the small shape grow smaller in the wake and then disappear, and he felt something unexpected move through his chest. Not grief exactly, but acknowledgement. He had never learned the boy's name. He had never spoken a single word to him. But for 3 nights they had existed a few feet apart, sharing the cold and the spray and the sound of each other breathing. And now one of them was gone, and the sea had already closed over the place where he had been. He returned to his oar. 1 fewer rower meant more load on the rest, and his body was already burning through its reserves faster than the food they gave him could replace. He did the calculation without wanting to. Insufficient calories, increasing workload, muscles consuming themselves, a direction with only one destination at the end. He needed more food, or less work, or ideally both, and a thrall does not choose. So he counted. Counting kept the brain busy with something other than hunger and pain and the yawning possibility of hopelessness.
He counted the planks on the deck, the rings in the jarl's chainmail, the strokes per minute, the ripples on the water that told him wind speed, the exact distance to the horizon using the formula he still remembered from a physics class in a world that now felt like a story someone else had told him once.
Useless knowledge, but it occupied the machinery of his mind and kept it from rusting. By evening, the ship was threading past a rocky outcrop, the helmsman steering perhaps 100 meters from the jagged coastline. He could see the dark patches of submerged rock through the greenish water, close, dangerously close. And then, the wind came. A gust hit the sail without lauding. The ship heeled hard to port. Water crashed over the side, and on the left, an oar snapped with a sound like a rifle shot. The warrior it hit grabbed his face with blood pouring between his fingers. The ship was spinning toward the rocks. He could see them clearly, 50 meters away, then 30. The helmsman was heaving on the tiller with every vein in his neck standing out, but the current was stronger than one man's arms. 20 meters. And then he did something he had told himself he would not do. He shouted.
One word. The word he had heard the helmsman use when changing course. A command to the starboard rowers to back off their stroke, while the port side pulled hard.
Simple physics. Differential thrust to create rotational force and swing the bow away from the rocks. He bellowed it with everything his exhausted body had.
A few starboard rowers hesitated, maybe from surprise, maybe because the command was correct and their bodies recognized it.
For 1 second, the starboard side went light. The port side kept cooler. The ship turned 2 degrees, then 3.
The helmsman felt the change and threw the tiller all the way over. The ship passed 10 meters from the rocks, so close he could see the wet seaweed on their surface, and then they were in open water.
Everyone breathed. The red-bearded man stood in the middle of the deck and watched the rocks fall away astern, then turned and found the thrall who had shouted. Their eyes met.
3 seconds.
5.
He dropped his gaze, as the body had been trained to do, but too late.
The red-bearded man had already seen something he would not forget. That night, he lay on the planks and cursed himself thoroughly for breaking his own rule.
Too soon, too visible. One word shouted in a moment of panic, and now someone in a position of power was thinking about him.
A thinking Viking was an unpredictable Viking.
He had no way of knowing which direction that thought was traveling.
Then he thought differently.
The ship was alive.
He was alive. Everyone was alive. And maybe the red-bearded man was not thinking about punishment, but about the question of how a thrall had known the right word at the right moment.
Maybe this was the first hook, the first thread, the first microscopic crack in the wall between what he was and what he needed to become.
Or it was the first step toward a very short ending.
Both possibilities sat in his chest with equal weight as he tried to sleep.
Retribution arrived in the morning, but not the kind he had braced for.
The red-bearded man came without violence, untied the rope from the bench, grabbed him by the collar, and walked him forward toward the bow.
Toward the jarl.
Thralls did not go to the jar. Thralls did not see the jar. Thralls did not exist in the jarl's world. And yet here he was being walked toward the tall man with the light hair and the chainmail, standing at the carved prow eating smoked meat.
Fat dripped from the jarl's fingers.
He looked at the thrall being presented to him the way one might look at a dead fish the tide had deposited on the beach, with mild curiosity and no strong feeling. The red-bearded man spoke.
Rock, word, shout, the key fragments cutting through what he couldn't follow yet.
The jar wiped his hand on his trousers and spoke one short word.
Speak. He stood there and assembled his 25 words into a message, pointing to himself, then over the side toward the rocks, already a day behind them, then miming an impact with his hands.
Stone, ship, strike.
Then he showed the oars, demonstrated with his hands, how one side slowing while the other pulled hard would rotate the hull.
Simple physics rendered in gesture and 3-word sentences. A child explaining engineering to grown men who might kill him for knowing it. The jarl turned and asked the helmsman something. The helmsman replied with a single brief nod.
Confirmed.
The thrall's word had been correct.
The jarl asked where the knowledge had come from, and he had spent all night preparing his answer. He pointed to his ears, then to the helmsman.
I heard him, he spoke, I remembered. A simple lie, a plausible one, because slaves hear everything. They simply have no reason to speak.
The jarl looked at him for another long moment, then said something brief to the red-bearded man.
He was walked not back to the old bench, but to a new spot, closer to the stern, closer to the helmsman. The rope was lengthened to 3 meters, and then the red-bearded man tossed him a piece of meat, smoked, the same quality the jarl had been eating, a piece the size of a palm. He sat and stared at it. His hands were shaking, not from cold, from hunger, and from the weight of what had just happened. He had not been killed.
He had been moved closer to the man who steered the ship.
He had been given meat. This was not generosity, it was investment. The jarl investing calories in a slave whose brain might be worth something. The logic of a merchant weighing return on expenditure. He ate the meat slowly, every fiber, every gram of salt and protein and fat, and his body responded with something close to joy.
The helmsman's name was Bjorn. He learned it from the way the warriors addressed him. Bjorn, meaning bear, a name that fit the lean, calm man precisely. Bjorn paid no attention to the thrall now sitting 3 meters away.
To the helmsman, the thrall at the new bench was as blank as the sea. But the thrall was listening to every word Bjorn spoke. Current, tide, shoal, depth, north wind, storm, fog, bearing, the vocabulary of navigation accumulating in his mental library like coins dropping into a jar. Over the next 3 days, he added 40 words. All of them useful. The priest was also watching. He felt it without seeing it directly, the quality of attention in the corner of his vision, a stillness that was not casual. The red-bearded man was simple. The jarl was pragmatic. Bjorn was indifferent. But the priest was searching, and what he was searching for was something he sensed rather than saw. That this thrall was not quite like the others. Not smarter, stranger. A stranger from somewhere that wasn't a place on any map. On the 7th day of sailing, land appeared that the Vikings recognized. He could tell by the change in the ship, the loosening of shoulders, the different quality of the voices, men who had been away returning. A rocky coastline, dark cliffs, green slopes falling to the water, and then a fjord opening in the rock like a doorway, narrow and long, the water inside it going calm and flat. After a week of open ocean, the silence of the fjord felt almost supernatural, like the world had been paused. At its head lay a settlement, long wooden houses with thatched roofs, a dock of rough logs, boats pulled up on the shore. Smoke from a dozen hearths. Women and children stood on the shore, waiting.
The warriors came home with their spoils, to embraces and shouting, and children grabbing at their legs.
He and the other thralls were led ashore and lined up, and people from the settlement came to look at the new captives, the way you look at cattle brought back from market. He stood in the line and scanned the settlement, counting and cataloging, with a part of his brain that never stopped working. 20 or 30 houses, maybe 100 people, a smithy, cattle pens, a few fishing boats, a small and complete and entirely self-sufficient world at the edge of the fjord. This was where he would have to live. This was where he would have to become something, or not. The slave house was on the outskirts, lower and smaller than every other building, with a dirt floor and the smell of manure and old straw. He was tied to a post. Straw was tossed on the floor as bedding. He lay down on it, damp and moldy as it was, and felt the solid, unmoving ground beneath him. And after a week on the sea, it felt close to luxury. He pressed his hand against his ribs where the yarrow had dried to brittle stems he'd carried across the North Sea. His first possession, pitiful and small, but his. He closed his eyes. Phase 1 was over. He had survived at sea. Phase 2 was beginning to become useful on land and to stay alive while doing it.
The first morning on land began before dawn with a boot connecting with each thrall's leg in turn.
He was on his feet instantly because the rule was already part of him. A slow thrall is a broken thrall. They were led outside into fog that lay across the fjord like milk in a bowl, cold and thick, the air smelling of grass and wood smoke and the salt edge of the water.
The red-bearded man distributed work by gesture and short commands.
2 thralls to the livestock pens to clean manure. The woman and one of the new English captives to the jarl's longhouse for cooking and cleaning. The scarred man to the smithy to carry coal and pump the bellows. The old man with the empty eyes was left where he was, because the old man could no longer do anything useful, and that was a sentence in this world, even if no one said it aloud. The red-bearded man looked at him for a moment, then led him to the shore where several small boats lay upside down, with boards warped from winter exposure and gaps in the caulking. A barrel of tar sat nearby.
The gesture was clear.
Fill the cracks, seal the gaps, repair what winter had broken. He knew the principle from museum exhibits and shipbuilding history that had seemed utterly abstract until this moment. He worked all day with his hands going black with tar, the smell so sharp it caught in the back of his throat, and he worked carefully, methodically, with the deliberateness of someone who understood that quality of work is a language everyone speaks, regardless of whether they consider you a human being. When the red-bearded man came to check and ran his finger along the sealed seam and found it clean and even, he said nothing.
He did not strike him.
He did not frown. For a thrall, that silence was the highest available praise. While he worked, he watched the settlement and mapped its structure against what he knew from the textbooks. The jarl at the top, large house, wife and silver jewelry. Below him, the bonds. Maybe 10 free landowners, each with a house and their own livestock. Below them, the carls, free but poor, working as laborers and fishermen. And at the very bottom, the thralls, because beneath the carl and the slave lay a chasm that almost nothing could cross. A carl could become a bond if fortune helped him. A thrall could not do anything. A thrall could only die, unless the owner decided otherwise. Unless the owner chose to release him. This happened rarely, but he knew from history that it did happen, for exceptional service, by will, or by ransom, and ransom was the real path. But ransom required money, and thralls had no money, and that was a circle with no entry point. He thought about this while caulking the second boat, turning it over slowly in his mind. A circle is not a wall. A circle can be broken. Not by force, which he did not have, but by making himself so useful that it became more profitable to raise him than to keep him where he was. Economic logic was the only logic that reliably moved people in any century. On the 5th day on shore, he heard a scream from the direction of the smithy. The big, scarred thrall was on the ground, holding his right arm, and blood was soaking through his fingers from a long gash that ran from elbow to wrist, where a piece of red-hot metal had slipped. The blacksmith stood cursing, angry about losing a worker. The red-bearded man came, looked at the wound, and ordered it bound with a rag, which was the only option anyone in this world would think of. He looked at the wound from where he stood and pressed his hand against the dried yarrow under his shirt. The right moment. Or too soon again. He didn't know. He made the choice. He stood up and walked toward the red-bearded man, which was itself a violation. A thrall does not approach without being summoned. And the man looked at him with irritation that had enough danger in it to feel like a physical warning. He pulled the yarrow out and held it up, then pointed at the wound, then crushed a few dry leaves between his fingers and pressed them against the back of his own hand, demonstrating. The red-bearded man stared. He repeated the gesture. Then he knelt by the wounded man, who was looking at him with eyes wild from pain, and pressed the crushed leaves against the gash. He held them there. After a minute, the bleeding began to slow, achillinine doing what it always did, accelerating clotting, requiring no explanation, producing its result with quiet chemical certainty. The red-bearded man watched the blood stop. He spoke a phrase in a tone that was puzzled rather than hostile. A slave who knew nautical commands and a slave who knew herbs. He stepped back and lowered his eyes, and he had revealed exactly what was necessary and not one grain more. The knowledge of a single herb that any village woman might possess.
Nothing supernatural. Just another small piece falling into place on a board whose shape only he could see.
After the yarrow incident, the outward conditions of his life changed only slightly. The kicks in the morning stopped. The bowl of porridge gained 2 or 3 spoonfuls. Small adjustments that were in fact the difference between standing and falling. The scarred man's wound healed, slowly and imperfectly, a red scar from elbow to wrist. But the arm worked. The hand could grip. He could survive. His name here was Torghast. Whatever name he had carried before captivity, no one here used it. One evening, Torghast came and sat beside him in the slave house without a word, placed a small piece of flatbread on the ground between them, then went back to his place. The bread was 2 fingers wide. In a world where you might own nothing at all, 2 fingers of flatbread was a fortune freely given. He ate it and understood what it meant. First ally. The language was coming faster now, because he worked at it every waking hour, without ceasing.
Old Norse shared enough Germanic roots with English and German that his mind could build bridges, and across 2 weeks he was catching every third sentence, then every second.
He said nothing that wasn't necessary.
A listening thrall is invisible, and invisible was exactly what he needed to be while the vocabulary accumulated.
Bjorn, the helmsman, sometimes sat near the pier in the evenings and muttered to himself about weather and currents. One afternoon, the helmsman stopped near him and looked at the sky and spoke a long, slow sentence. He understood nearly all of it.
Bjorn was saying the clouds from the west meant a storm in 2 days. He looked at the clouds, the feathery high cirrus being replaced by lower heavy cumulus, a classic frontal approach, and Bjorn was exactly right.
2 days later, the wind tore at rooftops, and rain came down horizontal, and the fjord churned white. And he lay in the slave house, listening to water come through the cracks, and thought not about the rain, but about the priest. The priest had never approached him, but the watching had not stopped. Every day, from somewhere in the settlement, a corner, a shadow, the mast by the pier, those small, quick eyes found him and stayed. He understood what the priest was doing. The priest's power in this world was based on knowledge, on knowing things others did not, about gods, about signs, about the hidden structure of fate. And now, a thrall had appeared, who also knew things. Things he should not know. For a man whose entire position rested on being the one who knew, this was not merely interesting. It was a threat.
He decided to act before the priest made his own move.
Every morning from that point, he went through a small performance, standing on the shore and looking at the sky for a long time, then at the ground, at the dew and the direction of the chimney smoke.
Simple meteorology, observable patterns that had nothing mystical in them.
But from the outside, performed with the right stillness and focus, it looked like a ritual.
Like someone reading signs.
4 days later, the priest approached. He stopped 2 paces away and spoke slowly, as one speaks to a child or an animal.
He asked what the thrall saw.
3 words in reply.
Wind changed tomorrow.
Not a vision, not a prophecy, just pressure shifting and birds flying lower than usual, and ripples on the water reading in a particular way.
The priest looked at him for a long moment, then left without a word. The next day, the wind turned north, cold and sharp.
The priest stood by the longhouse and watched the weather vane on the smithy roof confirm what the thrall had said, and then he looked toward the shore, where the thrall was caulking his next boat.
Their eyes met for 1 second.
He looked away. The hook had been set. He only had to wait for the priest to follow it.
3 days later, the priest came again, this time with a piece of smoked fish placed on the ground like bait in front of a trap.
He kept working. The priest waited, then spoke at length about Odin walking among people in the guise of a beggar, about knowledge being a gift the gods give to those they mark. He understood that the priest was trying to classify him, to find a slot in his worldview that could contain what he was seeing, and the slot he was reaching for was the marked one, the God-touched.
He did not argue. He took the fish and ate it slowly, and then he said that he heard things others did not hear.
Vague enough to mean anything. Specific enough to confirm what the priest already suspected. The priest's eyes lit up in a way that was almost alarming in its eagerness, and he left quickly, moving toward the jarl's longhouse at something close to a run. He sat with the fish and understood what had just happened. He had made his second move in the game. The priest would now carry the story upward, translating what he had observed into the language of signs and omens, wrapping the thrall's knowledge in the vocabulary of the divine. It was a dangerous alliance. The same priest who could frame him as Odin-touched could reframe him as demon-possessed if the wind changed.
But right now, it was the only path upward that existed.
That evening, Torghast sat beside him again and spoke quietly and at length, and he listened.
5 years a slave.
Captured from a fishing village on the coast. A wife he knew nothing about anymore. He listened without interrupting or offering comfort, because in a world where you are nothing, Sometimes the only gift available is your full attention.
When Torgest asked how he had known about the yarrow, he said his mother had taught him.
A lie, simple and uncheckable, and Torgest accepted it the way people accept things that feel true enough.
He lay awake afterward and thought about the merchant who had visited with rigged scales.
He had watched the man cheat the jarl out of a tenth on every transaction, the lighter weight bouncing wrong on the bronze pan. Impossible to miss if you understood what you were seeing. That information sat in his memory like a loaded weapon, but a weapon has to be fired at the right target, at the right moment, and the moment had not yet come.
Patience, he reminded himself.
The main weapon of the weak.
The only weapon of a slave. Autumn arrived fast, the days contracting, the sun hanging low over the fjord like it was reluctant to commit. He was put to different work now, carrying stones, chopping wood, cleaning fish, unloading nets, everything the settlement needed done that no one valuable enough to care about should be risked doing.
His body was adapting.
Slowly and painfully, but adapting. Muscles that had been rope were becoming something harder. Hands that shook under weight were beginning to hold it.
A merchant ship arrived from somewhere outside the fjord, wider and lower than a drakkar, its hold packed with cloth and salt and silver goods and spices.
The settlement came alive around it, people crowding the dock to examine and haggle, and he watched from his position near the boats.
He saw the jarl approach the merchant, and the negotiation began.
He watched the bronze scales come out, and he watched the weights, and within 2 transactions, he saw it.
One weight was too light.
It dropped faster, bounced more lightly. A difference of maybe 10%. Systematic, intentional, built into every sale the merchant made.
The jarl would pay a tenth more for everything he bought, and he would never know, because you have to understand the physics of the thing to see the cheat.
He watched and said nothing, and remembered everything.
The merchant sailed away 2 days later, and the jarl's silver was lighter than it should have been.
The moment for that information would come.
Then came the day another ship arrived from a neighboring fjord. A warship, and on it another jarl, Sigurd, shorter and broader than Hakon, with a pockmarked face and fierce eyes, 20 warriors at his back.
Not war, a meeting. He could not attend the feast that night, but a female thrall who worked in the longhouse told him what she had heard.
The 2 jarls were discussing a joint campaign.
Not a village raid.
A real military campaign. To the south. To England. In the spring.
His pulse quickened in the way it does when something large you have been waiting for begins to show its shape.
If the decade was the 860s, this might be the Great Pagan Army, the campaign that would conquer most of England and change the island's history for centuries.
And this was one of the settlements that would take part.
A great campaign meant great preparation, ships and provisions and weapons and men and all the logistics that held an army together. And logistics was mathematics, and mathematics was his.
But first, the move with the merchant.
Time had come. The next morning, Jarl Sigurd was still in the settlement, and Hakon and Sigurd were standing together on the pier with the priest and Bjorn and the red-bearded man, the full circle of people who mattered.
He went to the red-bearded man and spoke quietly.
3 sentences.
I need to tell the jar something important.
The merchant who came cheated him.
The weights on the scales were wrong.
The red-bearded man stared, grabbed him by the collar, and walked him to the jarl, the way you walk a dog that has found something interesting in the undergrowth.
Hakon turned and frowned. He spoke, choosing each word, describing the lighter weight and the pattern of the bouncing, how the merchant always placed it first, how the jarl had paid a tenth more in silver than everything was worth. He did not use technical language. He described only what his eyes had seen, the way the weight moved differently from the others, the way he had been watching because there was nothing else to watch, and a thrall's eyes are always open.
Hakon listened with a face like stone. No anger, no surprise, just attention. Then he turned to Sigurd and asked if he knew the merchant.
Sigurd laughed, briefly and without humor, and said the man's name was Kettle,
and that many suspected, and no one had ever been able to prove it.
Hakon looked at him for a long, cold, calculating moment.
And then he said, in front of everyone, that this thrall had better eyes than his advisors. Spoken in front of Sigurd, in front of Bjorn, in front of the priest, in front of the red-bearded man.
The jarl's words defined reality in this world. He did not set the thrall free, did not reward him in silver, did not praise him.
He stated a fact.
This slave has good eyes.
And that was enough.
On the walk back, the red-bearded man did something he had never done before. He said a name, Ingar, the name of the body's original owner, the name no one had used since the body became his to occupy. Then a pause, then a word that meant something like sharp-eyed. Einar, the sharp-eyed. He had not chosen the name and did not own the body it had once belonged to. But he had earned the nickname himself in front of witnesses, with the jarl's voice carrying it forward. That was the first thing in this world that was truly his, not the yarrow he had picked up from the ground. A word spoken publicly and heard by people who mattered. After that, things shifted the way tides shift, slow and enormous and inevitable. He was still sent to carry stones and chop wood, but now he was also brought along when Bjorn inspected the jockers before winterizing them. Stand here, look, watch what the helmsman is checking, the way he sniffed the wood for sweetness that meant rot, the way he knocked his knuckles against the hull and listened for the dull sound of hollow space hiding beneath. He stood beside Bjorn and translated every sensory check into the underlying engineering, the structural logic of load-bearing wood and tensile strength and joint stress. Knowledge that Bjorn carried in his hands and nose and ears, while he carried it in his head. Then came the day Bjorn found the crack in the keel. Long, running from the bow toward the middle of the hull. Not deep, but dangerous. The kind of thing that lengthens with every season, until one day the sea comes in. Bjorn crouched over it and swore with the particular frustration of a man who knows that repairing a keel is almost like building a new ship. He looked at the crack from where he stood and saw what Bjorn didn't see, that the crack had curved around a knot in the wood, because knots are the strongest point in timber, and the crack had followed the path of least resistance past it. If they reinforced the area around the knot and sealed the crack and laid an iron strip over the repair, the keel would hold for at least another season. He said nothing. He held his place. But Bjorn felt the quality of attention at his back and turned and asked two words. What do you see?
The first words the helmsman had ever directed at him as a person, rather than at the space he occupied.
He pointed to the knot. He said the knot was strong, that the crack had passed around it, that if they filled the crack with resin and laid iron over the knot, the plank would hold until spring. Bjorn looked at the knot, then at him, then at the crack. He said nothing. An hour later, Bjorn was heating an iron strip in the forge. He placed it over the crack, over the knot, exactly as described. No thanks, no acknowledgement, not even a glance. But the helmsman did what the thrall had suggested, and both of them knew it, and that was worth more than any spoken word. Winter preparations consumed the settlement. Women salting fish and smoking meat, men repairing roofs and packing stalls with livestock, the whole community moving against the cold with the seriousness of people who understood that winter was not a season, but an adversary. He watched the supply distribution and saw the problem clearly. The jarl and the bonds had plenty, the carls had barely enough, and the thralls would get the scraps, and if the winter ran long, starvation would start at the bottom and move up. He couldn't solve the settlement's supply problem, but he could solve his own. Near the slave house stood an old, crooked birch tree that no one needed and no one noticed. He began cutting small pieces of inner bark in the evenings, the thin white film beneath the rough outer layer, edible, bitter, nearly worthless in calories, but not completely worthless. He dried it under straw and ground it between stones, and formed it into dense, bitter lumps. Torgus ate them with skepticism.
He didn't die. So it worked.
He also found wild garlic on the slope above the settlement, small bulbs the size of a fingernail containing vitamin C.
Scurvy killed people in this world as surely as iron did.
1 bulb a day, bitter and necessary. Then came the evening the priest arrived with the jarl's wife.
Hilda, tall and fair-haired, with silver brooches on her shoulders and a ring of keys on her belt, the keys that meant she ran the household, which in this world was a kind of kingdom in miniature.
She looked at him with a curiosity that was clinical and entirely without sentiment. She asked directly and steadily if he knew of any plants for a stomach ailment. He thought quickly. Stomach pain without more detail could be many things, but mint was universal, safe, effective for cramps and digestion, impossible to harm someone with. He said he knew the herb, that he could show where it grew, that the leaves steeped in hot water and drunk in small sips would help. The next morning, his hands were untied for the first time.
He stood and looked at the red marks on his wrists, and opened and closed his fists, and felt something out of proportion to the simple physical sensation.
The red-bearded man stood 3 paces away with an axe on his belt, watching, but his hands were free, and that was a different category of existence from what it had been before. He found the mint, gathered a bunch, and was brought inside the jarl's longhouse for the first time in his life. 30 meters of smoky, dark interior, a long hearth burning down the center, skins on the walls, weapons on hooks, the smell of roasted meat and wood smoke and human warmth. A boy of about 7 sat pale and hunched on a bench beside Hilda, the jarl's son, clutching his stomach. He brewed the mint and gave it to the boy, who drank in small, pained sips and grimaced and drank more.
An hour later, the boy's color had returned, and he had fallen asleep.
Hilda looked at her sleeping son, and then at him, and in her eyes he saw something he had not seen in a single face since waking up on the ship. Not gratitude exactly.
A debt. The woman who ran the jarl's household owed him something small, and in a world where he owned nothing, a small debt from someone powerful was the closest thing to treasure that existed.
Winter arrived hard and fast, snow coming for 3 days without pause until everything was buried and the fjord turned black and heavy with cold.
The slave house was barely better than the open air, thin log walls bleeding the night's cold through every gap. He organized the thralls without ceremony, no commands, just demonstration. Showed them how to press together at night rather than sleeping separately, bodies sharing heat the way animals in a burrow survive winter. He stuffed stolen straw into the cracks between the logs and gained 3 degrees of warmth that kept them on the right side of the line. The old man died quietly in his sleep, as expected. The young thrall from the ship, Canute, 16 years old, developed frostbite in 3 toes. He saw the black when Canute removed his wrappings that evening and felt the weight of what that meant in a world without surgery or anesthetic. He went to the red-bearded man and said the boy would lose the leg if the toes weren't cut off. The red-bearded man looked and shrugged, the way someone shrugs about a tool that will still function after partial repair, and took the boy to the blacksmith.
He didn't watch. He heard one long scream, and then silence.
Canute came back pale and 3 toes lighter, and he washed the wound with garlic broth every day thereafter, changing the bandage from clean rags rinsed in snowmelt, applying the simplest principle of medicine this world had never encountered.
Canute survived.
He became quieter and more serious, and he started listening to Einar the way you listen to someone whose judgment has proven itself against your own body. Third ally. In the deep winter, in the middle of the night, the priest came alone and sat across from him in the darkness of the slave house. He said he knew, that he sensed what the thrall was not, that no dream could grant such precise knowledge of coastlines and tides, that he had been a priest for 30 years and knew what real visions looked like.
And these were not them.
The cold in his chest was immediate and total. Then the priest said something unexpected.
He said he didn't care where the knowledge came from.
He said he was getting old, and his knees hurt, and his teeth were going, and in 5 or 10 years he would be dead, and he needed someone to inherit his position with the jarl. He was offering the deal. Cover for the thrall. Help him rise. Speak the right words to the jarl about divine favor and marked men. Build the path upward, and in return, the thrall would become the priest's apprentice, his successor, the carrier of his legacy after death.
He thought through it quickly. Too generous to be without a hook, but the hook was understandable, an old man trying to control the future from beyond his own death.
The alternative was years more of hauling stones toward an ending that probably involved a grave in frozen ground.
He said yes, then added one condition.
Torgist would be moved from the smithy to easier work.
The priest blinked, surprised that a thrall was bargaining for another thrall, then nodded easily, because moving one slave from one job to another cost him nothing, and signaled the deal was real.
They sat in the dark slave house, and 2 men agreed on a future, one who was losing his power, one who was beginning to accumulate it.
He had sold himself a second time.
But the first time he'd had no choice, and the second time the choice was his, and that difference was not small.
Spring broke the fjord open like a fist unclenching, streams running high with meltwater, birds returning, the settlement coming out of its dens into pale sunshine.
The drakkar was pulled from shore and relaunched, and he watched Bjorn inspect the keel repair and see the iron strip sitting clean over the knot where he had suggested it.
Bjorn said nothing, but a brief glance passed between them that contained what needed no words.
Hakon announced the departure.
25 warriors from this settlement, joining Sigurd's men and others gathering along the coast, dozens of ships converging toward the rendezvous point where the full army would assemble.
The morning of departure, he was walked to the ship by the red-bearded man, but not to a rowing bench.
To the stern.
Bjorn was at the tiller, and he looked at Einar and nodded toward the space beside him.
Sit. He sat down at the stern of the drakkar, collar still at his throat, rope still at his wrists, but looking out at the sea from the place where the ship was steered.
Hilda stood on the shore with the boy beside her, the boy whose stomach had been soothed by mint tea and whose color had come back, and who now waved at the departing ship.
Torgist was not on the ship, moved to net mending as promised, safer and lighter work, the priest's word having done its small, useful thing.
The fjord carried them out, and the open sea received them, and when they reached the rendezvous bay, the scale of what awaited him stopped the breath in his throat. 50 ships, maybe more, drakkars and transport vessels arrayed across the water, carved prows facing in every direction, the collected intention of dozens of jarls and hundreds of warriors aimed at a single coastline.
He sat at the stern and looked at the army, and felt something cold run the length of his spine that was not entirely fear.
He knew what this force would do. He had read it in books, seen it reconstructed in documentaries, walked through the aftermath in museum exhibits. The great pagan army, 865, landing in East Anglia, wintering there, marching north in the spring to take York, unraveling Northumbria, and then Mercia, and then East Anglia again, stopped only at Wessex by the one king the history books called the Great.
This was that army, and he was part of it, a slave in a collar on the stern of one of 50 ships, small and insignificant, but carrying a map of the future in his head that no one else on any of those ships possessed.
That night, he asked Bjorn to bring him to the jar. Hakon came alone to the stern in the dock.
He spoke quickly and with precision. Northumbria was weak right now, 2 kings fighting each other for the throne, their armies depleted and exhausted. York's Roman walls old and partially crumbled, with the northern section weakest where no one had repaired the stones. Strike fast, strike precisely. Take the city before the 2 kings could unite against the common enemy.
He said he had heard this from merchants at his former master's settlement, which was half a lie with enough plausibility to hold. Hakon's eyes in the moonlight were 2 pieces of gray ice, still and calculating.
Then he looked at Einar with something that had not been in his gaze before.
Not indifference, not curiosity.
Interest. The particular cold interest of a man who has found a tool that is better than expected.
The next day, the council of jarls continued, and by evening, Hakon returned to the ship with the particular calm of a man who has won an argument he expected to lose.
The army was going north, to Northumbria, through East Anglia, exactly as the textbook said it would.
History had not been changed.
It had been nudged along the tracks it was already running on, but Hakon was now the voice of that direction, and the voice of a correct decision is worth something in a world that runs on reputation.
The crossing of the North Sea took 4 days. On the second day, a headwind from the west slowed the fleet, and Bjorn prepared to row into it for the rest of the afternoon.
He looked at the clouds, the lower layer moving west, the upper layer moving east, a wind shift coming in a few hours. He told Bjorn quietly, barely above the sound of the water, that the wind would change, and they should wait. Bjorn looked at him with the hard expression of a helmsman who does not enjoy being instructed, then looked at the sky. He did not give the rowing order. 2 hours later, the wind shifted to a strong tailwind, and the sails filled, and the fleet surged forward. Bjorn looked at the sea, then at him, just for a moment, and there was something new in the helmsman's eyes that had not been there before.
Not friendship, respect.
For knowledge. On the 4th day, the storm hit without warning. Black sky in an hour, waves to the height of the mast, rain coming sideways.
The fleet scattered, every ship for itself, and the Drakkar plunged into the storm like something trying to survive rather than travel. He bailed water alongside the warriors, the collar pressing against his throat with every pitch of the deck. The collar and the rope and the thrall's place all still exactly in place, while the sea demonstrated that it recognized no hierarchy among the men it was trying to drown.
The storm lasted 6 hours.
When the sky cleared, the stars spilled out across the black water, and he took his bearing and knew they had been driven 30 miles south.
Bjorn knew it too, and corrected north, and by dawn they saw the low, flat coast of East Anglia. They had arrived, not exactly where planned, but in England, which was where everything was going anyway.
47 ships reassembled in the bay.
3 were missing. Each of those ships had carried 30 to 40 people, more than 100 lives taken by a storm that didn't care about the difference between warrior and thrall.
The jarls gathered on shore and argued again, some pointing south at easy targets, some toward the north, and the plan Hakon had already laid out.
Hakon stood and was silent, and then he turned toward the ship and found Einar at the stern, and held the look for a moment, before turning back to the other jarls and speaking.
He could not hear the words, but he saw the result.
By evening, the decision was made. The army would winter in East Anglia and march on Northumbria in spring.
Exactly as history recorded.
The year was 865. He was certain of it now, the date landing in his mind with the solidity of a calculation that has checked itself. He knew what would come next, across the following years: the fall of York, the collapse of Northumbria, the grinding conquest of Mercia, the one kingdom that would hold. He was not steering these events. He could not have stopped them if he had wanted to.
He was a grain of sand riding a wave that was going to break regardless of what he did. But he knew which way the wave was breaking.
In the winter camp in East Anglia, his position changed again, quietly and without ceremony. He walked freely among the warriors now, ropes gone from his wrists, eating at the same table, the same food, in the same quantities.
The collar remained, and his status remained, but the daily texture of it was different, something between thrall and something that didn't have a name yet.
Bjorn began speaking to him as an assistant, asking about weather and winds and omens, and he answered at 10% above what Bjorn could have worked out on his own, careful not to give more than was useful and not enough to become frightening. The priest moved through the camp, building the network that priests build, strengthening his connections, and occasionally looked across the fire at him with the look of a man who has made an investment and is quietly watching it grow. He sat in the winter camp in 865, a slave with a collar and a head full of the future, and he understood something about himself that he hadn't understood before arriving in this world.
He had spent his previous life with knowledge that never quite connected to anything real.
He had known that the earth was round and that germs caused disease and that the Gulf Stream carried warm water northward, and none of it had ever mattered in any practical sense, not once.
Now every fragment of that library was a tool.
The epidemiology that made him turn his face from the coughing boy.
The herbalism that slowed Torgestisplague.
The meteorology that predicted 2 wind shifts on the North Sea.
The structural engineering that saved a keel.
The history that told him where 50 ships would anchor in spring.
The mathematics that caught a merchant cheating a jarl.
None of it had seemed like survival knowledge before.
All of it was.
He had arrived in this world as a zero. Nothing. Less than nothing. A body in a collar on a bench. And he had spent every waking hour since then, carefully, patiently, precisely, converting knowledge into trust, trust into position, position into something that did not yet have a name, but was moving in a direction.
He was not free. He was not safe.
He was not anything that the world he had left would recognize as success.
But he was alive, which had seemed unlikely on the ship.
He had allies in Torgest and Canute and Edmund.
He had connections in the priest and in Bjorn, and in the small, quiet debt that Hilda carried for a boy who had slept with a full stomach after mint tea.
And he had the jarl's recognition, spoken in public, that this thrall saw things others missed.
The collar at his throat was iron, and the iron was real, and he did not pretend otherwise.
But the collar had a lock, and locks have mechanisms, and mechanisms can be understood. In the slave house on the ship, he had made a plan with 3 points. Survive until shore. Become useful. Do not die.
He had done all 3. Now the plan needed new points.
He was thinking through what those points would be when the priest sat down across the fire from him in the winter camp and looked at him with the particular expression of a man who has decided that his investment is performing as expected.
He looked back without lowering his eyes. In the past, every thrall lowered their eyes.
Eyes down meant you understood what you were.
He had done it too.
It had been necessary, and he had not resented it.
But tonight, he held the priest's gaze for 1 full second before looking away, and the priest noticed, and neither of them said anything, and both of them understood.
He had not arrived in 865 as a conqueror or a hero or a man with a destiny written somewhere. He had arrived as a dead man on a cold ship with a collar and no language, and nothing except what was stored in his skull.
And he had turned that into something small, fragile, easy to destroy,
But real.
Built from nothing, in a world that had assigned him nothing, piece by piece, in the cold and the dark and the salt air of the North Sea.
Whatever came next, that could not be taken back.